They assumed silence would come easy to me. When you live just outside the gates, you're expected to absorb inconvenience quietly, like background noise no one needs to acknowledge. I didn't fit their image of resistance. No lawn committee, no board seat. Just a man on his own land, beyond their rules, beyond their concern. Or so they thought. I bought this property for one reason: autonomy. After years of structure, of orders and systems designed by other people, I wanted space that answered only to me. 2 acres, uneven ground, trees that leaned where they pleased, gravel that spoke under tires. No covenants, no dues, no letters taped to doors. Just ownership in its simplest form. The first winter storm changed that illusion. I stepped outside one morning expecting quiet and found my land reshaped. Not by weather alone, but by intention. A dense wall of dirty, compacted ice pressed against my boundary like an accusation. Gray with salt, streaked with grit, heavy in a way snowfall alone never is. It didn't belong here. And the tracks told the story clearly. Machines had crossed lines they were never invited to cross. At first I assumed mistake. People make those. Storms complicate judgment. But mistakes come with apologies, corrections, conversations. This came with none of that. Just mass, weight, silence. When I reached out, the response was polished and dismissive, wrapped in language that treated my land like overflow. Space, temporary, convenient, disposable. They didn't deny it happened. They simply implied I should accept it. That was the moment it stopped being about snow. Boundaries mean nothing if no one enforces them. Ownership isn't theoretical. It's practical, measured in feet and consequences. I documented everything, not with anger, but with precision. Photos, coordinates, timelines, every detail logged calmly, because truth doesn't need volume to be heard. It needs clarity. Still, the dumping continued. Fresh loads, deeper piles, clear defiance. They weren't testing weather. They were testing me, and they believed inconvenience would bend me into compliance. They were wrong, because patience isn't weakness, it's preparation. And when someone keeps placing their burden on your land, again and again, eventually you stop asking them to move it. You start deciding what to do with it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't cross their line. I simply began thinking differently about weight, placement, and consequence. About how something unwanted could be transformed into something impossible to ignore. They had been comfortable because the problem stayed on my side. That comfort was about to shift. And once it did, everything they believed about control, rules, and who mattered was going to change. I didn't rush into confrontation. Rushing gives people excuses. Instead, I prepared. Every boundary dispute eventually comes down to evidence, not emotion. And I intended to remove all doubt before making my next move. If they were going to keep crossing my line, I would record every inch of it. I started with cameras, one mounted high at the tree line, angled down toward the slope where the dumping always happened. Another lower, closer, overlapping the first. No blind spots. Motion activated, day and night. I treated it like an operation, because that's what it had become. Documentation wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. Then I went digital. Every clip was labeled by date and time. Every photo embedded with coordinates. I overlaid survey lines on satellite images, my property in red, theirs in blue, and traced the exact path their equipment took each time it crossed into my land. There was no interpretation required. The truth stood on its own. Within 2 weeks, I logged 6 separate violations, 6 deliberate crossings, 6 illegal dumps. By conservative estimates, they had pushed more than 50 tons of salt-contaminated ice onto my soil, not just snow. Road waste, chemicals, weight that would sink into the ground and linger. Long after winter ended, I studied the county code until I could quote it from memory. Disposal onto private land without written consent was prohibited. No emergency loophole, no gray area, and I had never consented. Not verbally, not in writing, not once. What I still didn't understand was why they chose me. That answer came in a hardware store aisle of all places. A quiet conversation with a snow contractor confirmed what I'd suspected. Cost-cutting, no proper disposal sites, no permits, and a belief that neighboring land without an HOA badge was simply unused space, easier to exploit than to manage responsibly. They didn't see a homeowner. They saw an empty margin. That realization changed everything. I compiled the evidence into a clean, professional dossier and delivered it directly to the HOA. No threats, no commentary, just facts. The silence that followed wasn't confidence. It was calculation. Then the sheriff arrived. Not for them, for me. They'd tried intimidation next, reframing defense as disruption. But law enforcement doesn't argue with footage. The deputies reviewed everything, nodded, and left with copies of my files. Another official record added. Another move that backfired. That night, another plow idled at the road, hesitated, and turned back. They were reconsidering. Testing different pressure points, hoping I'd blink first. I didn't, because by then this wasn't about inconvenience anymore. It was about a pattern of entitlement colliding with someone who refused to disappear quietly. I had proof. I had time. And I was done absorbing their problems without consequence. The next step wasn't reporting them. It was returning exactly what they'd given me, in a way they could finally. I waited for the right day, not out of hesitation but intention. Timing matters when you're dealing with weight, physics, and people who assume consequences only move in one direction. The forecast promised clear skies and firm ground beneath the ice. The kind of conditions that leave no room for accidents or excuses. The loader was already serviced. Tires chained. Hydraulics tested. I wasn't angry when I climbed into the seat. Anger makes mistakes. I was focused. What I planned wasn't retaliation. It was correction. I started slow, shaving the outer edge of the frozen mass. Each pass peeled away compacted layers, revealing how deliberately it had been stacked. This wasn't runoff. This was engineered displacement, designed to push their problems somewhere unseen. I followed gravity and the original path of intrusion, guiding the ice exactly where it had come from. No excess, no spillover. I stayed within inches of the boundary markers, letting the survey lines dictate every movement. Precision was the point. By mid-morning, the wall began to lean back toward Sterling Pines. Cars slowed on the road. A few stopped entirely. Phones came out. From behind tinted glass, people watched something unfamiliar unfold. Accountability in motion. There were no shouts, no gestures. Just the sound of machinery and the steady scrape of ice moving home. Someone called the HOA office. I knew because the calls came to me minutes later. Calm voices pretending concern, asking what I thought I was doing. I told them exactly what I was doing. Returning improperly dumped material to its point of origin. On my land during daylight, fully documented. They told me to stop. I didn't, because they had never asked me to start. By noon, the ice sat where it always should have been, piled neatly inside their boundary, directly adjacent to their main entrance. Not blocking traffic, not damaging property, just present, visible, impossible to ignore. That's when the tone changed. Threats followed. Legal language misused. Warnings that sounded impressive until you held them up against statute. I welcomed them all. Every word went on record. Every voicemail archived. The more they spoke, the clearer their panic became. The county inspector arrived first, then environmental services, then a city attorney. They stood together, boots crunching on the ice, reviewing footage on a tablet I provided. No raised voices, no dramatics, just professionals recognizing a problem that could no longer be hidden. The plows never moved that pile again. Instead, warning tape went up. Notices followed. Meetings were called. And somewhere behind closed doors, the realization settled in that I wasn't the variable they could control. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the road, I shut down the loader and stepped back onto my land. For the first time since winter began, my boundary felt real again. What followed wasn't loud. No shouting matches, no viral spectacle. Just the slow grinding machinery of accountability turning in a direction they hadn't planned for. Once officials became involved, the story stopped being about personalities and started being about paper trails. The city moved methodically. Soil samples were taken from my land, salt levels measured, contamination confirmed. The inspector explained it plainly. Dumping road waste on private property wasn't just a nuisance. It was an environmental violation with long-term consequences. Grass didn't just grow back from that. Neither did trust. The HOA's representatives arrived late and defensive. They spoke in rehearsed phrases, careful not to admit intent. Emergency procedures. Limited options. Temporary measures. None of it matched the timestamps, the footage, or the GPS overlays. The truth didn't argue back. It simply waited its turn. I watched from a distance as officials compared notes. Every few minutes, one of them glanced toward me. Not with suspicion, but with something closer to respect. I wasn't protesting. I wasn't obstructing. I had followed the rules more carefully than the people paid to enforce them. By the end of the day, citations were issued. Fines followed. A mandatory cease and desist landed squarely on the HOA's winter operations. Any future off-site dumping would trigger automatic penalties. No warnings, no negotiations. That night, an email arrived from the board. The tone was different now. Careful. Apologetic without saying the word. They requested a meeting. I agreed on my terms. We sat in a bright conference room days later, sunlight streaming through glass walls. Across the table were board members who looked smaller without authority to hide behind. Their president, Laura Wilkins, spoke most of the time. She didn't threaten. She didn't deflect. She acknowledged impact, damage, failure. It was the first honest conversation since the snow fell. They offered compensation for the land restoration, surveyed boundaries at their expense. A formal acknowledgement of fault filed with the city. I listened without interruption, not because I trusted them, but because I wanted every promise on record. When I left, the dynamic had shifted completely. They no longer spoke about me as an obstacle. I had become a reference point, a case study, a reminder of what happens when convenience overrides consent. Spring came early that year. The ice receded. The soil breathed again. Crews arrived to remediate the damage under strict oversight. New markers went up along the boundary, bright and unmistakable. I didn't celebrate. I observed. Because real resolution isn't about winning. It's about change that holds when no one's watching, and while the paperwork closed one chapter. I knew the real test would come later, when memory faded and shortcuts tempted people again. The knock came again, firmer this time. Not aggressive, just official. When I opened the door, 2 deputies stood on the porch, boots dusted with snow, breath fogging in the cold air. The older one scanned the wall behind me before speaking, his tone cooler than the last visit. "We're responding to a welfare check request from the HOA," he said, along with renewed concerns about route obstruction. There it was, Karen's new angle. If facts wouldn't break me, fear might. I stepped aside without hesitation and opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "Coffee's fresh." At the kitchen table, the folder was already waiting. Time-stamped footage, property maps, ordinance excerpts, drone angles showing the boundary line down to the inch. I laid it all out calmly, methodically, the same way I had every time before. The deputies watched. They listened, they read. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the quiet hum of the heater. When the older deputy finally spoke again, the accusation was gone from his voice. "You've been thorough," he said. "I had to be." "And the wall?" he asked. "Relocation of unauthorized material back to the boundary," I replied. "Nothing more." The younger deputy smirked before catching himself. The older one closed his notepad. "We'll classify this as a civil matter," he said. "No criminal violation. Clear documentation." As they stood to leave, the older deputy paused at the door. "Off the record," he said quietly. "I've taken more calls from that HOA this winter than the last 5 years combined. This is the first one that actually makes sense." I allowed myself a faint smile. Later that day, a single folded note appeared in my mailbox. No envelope, no name. "We didn't know the full story. We thought you were being difficult. That wasn't fair. I'm sorry, it wasn't applause I wanted." But the crack in their united front was finally visible. By the end of the week, the wall had taken on a life of its own. Photos spread through local Facebook groups. Someone pinned it on Google Maps and called it the Great Ice Barrier. Teenagers posed for selfies. A snowman effigy appeared one morning, complete with a tiny clipboard and red scarf. I didn't touch any of it. Instead, I added one final reinforcement layer. Not out of anger anymore, but principle. I had taken their burden and turned it into something solid, something undeniable. Karen was running out of moves, and this time everyone was watching. The welfare check didn't rattle me. It confirmed something far more important. Karen was running out of clean moves. 2 days after the deputies left, the dumping stopped entirely. No trucks crossed the road. No late-night plows idled near my ditch. Sterling pines went unnaturally quiet, the way organizations do when they realize every step forward might leave fingerprints. That silence didn't mean surrender. It meant paperwork. I woke one morning to find a fluorescent orange notice staked near my mailbox. Survey pending. Do not disturb. No signature. No company name. Just an attempt to reframe the battlefield. If they could blur the boundary, they could blur responsibility. So I sharpened the line instead. I hired my own licensed surveyor, county certified, meticulous, unimpressed by HOA theatrics. He spent half a day confirming what I already knew, hammering steel pins exactly where the original plat map said they belonged. When he finished, he handed me a stamped survey packet and said, "If anyone disputes this, they're not confused. They're lying." That night I scanned everything. Original deed, updated survey, drone overheads, time-stamped footage, ordnance citations, sheriff visit logs, show correspondence, including the cease and desist letter that quietly admitted surveillance of their illegal activity. I didn't send it to Karen. I sent it past her. County land use, environmental services, municipal risk management. 3 departments that don't posture, they calculate exposure. Within 48 hours, Sterling Pines received something they couldn't intimidate, threaten, or vote away. Formal requests for documentation, disposal contracts, winter operations plans, proof of authorized dumping sites, things Karen had never bothered to file. The truck still didn't return, but now the silence felt brittle, like ice stretched too thin. Because when HOAs stop bullying neighbors, they start blaming each other, and I knew what was coming next. Internal fractures, leaked emails, someone looking for a scapegoat. I stood on my porch that evening, watching the wall settle and harden under another freeze, taller now, denser than before. Not a symbol of anger, but containment. They had buried my land under their mess. Now the weight was shifting back onto them. The first crack didn't come from the city. It came from inside Sterling Pines. 3 nights after the county requests went out, voices carried across the trees long after dark. Not shouting, worse. Tight, controlled arguments, the kind people use when they know walls have ears and lawyers cost money. By morning, the HOA message board lit up. Emergency meeting. Attendance strongly encouraged. No agenda listed. That alone said everything. By noon, a black pickup with a contractor logo I hadn't seen before crept through the subdivision. It didn't plow. Didn't dump. It just stopped near the clubhouse, idled, then left. Someone was auditing. Someone was nervous. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mr. Bishop," a man said carefully, "this is Cole Mason, treasurer for Sterling Pines HOA. I'm calling to clarify a few things." Clarify, not deny, not threaten. He asked about timelines, about dates, about footage. He never once said you're wrong. Instead, he asked whether I'd be open to informal resolution. I told him the same thing I'd told the city. Everything I have is already documented. I'm not withholding anything. Long pause. Then quietly, "Did Karen authorize all dumping operations herself?" There it was. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That evening, lights burned late in the clubhouse. Cars came and went. One left fast enough to spray gravel. Another sat running for 20 minutes before its driver finally stepped out. Shoulders slumped. At 10:47 p.m., a new post appeared on the HOA board. All winter operations pending review. Contractors suspended until further notice. Translation: someone realized their name was on the paperwork. The wall didn't change that night. But the energy did. For the first time since this began, Sterling Pines wasn't looking outward for an enemy. They were looking at each other. And Karen, her house stayed dark. The city didn't arrive with sirens. They arrived with clipboards.
Thank you. I'll go over
Just
these and
after
get back
9
to
in
you
the
with any
morning,
questions.
2 white municipal trucks rolled down the county road and stopped short of the wall. Doors opened slowly. No urgency. No outrage. Just procedure. And that, more than anything, told me this had crossed a line Sterling Pines could no longer spin. The first man introduced himself as Marcus Lyons, Land Use and Compliance. His partner, Celia Grant, Environmental Services. They didn't ask me to explain the wall. They asked when the dumping started. That question mattered. I handed over the folder. I'd been building for weeks. Surveys, dates, time-stamped footage, GPS overlays, photos of my collapsed shed taken from 6 angles, repair estimates attached, every illegal load documented, every boundary crossing logged. They studied it in silence. Celia walked the base of the wall slowly, checking coordinates against her tablet. Marcus traced the property line with his boot, then looked up at the barricade rising inches inside it. "Well," he said finally, "you weren't careless. No, I replied. I was precise. They didn't smile, but something shifted. They photographed everything: the wall, the shoulder, the subdivision entrance. Then they turned away from my land entirely and focused inward toward Sterling Pines. That's when the real inspection began. They measured green spaces never meant to hold contaminated snow, probed soil behind the clubhouse, took samples near a drainage basin that fed directly toward protected wetlands. Each test added weight not to my wall but to the HOA's liability. By early afternoon, residents had gathered at a distance, watching as officials marked locations with orange paint and small flags. Phones came out. Whispers spread. The story was no longer about a difficult neighbor. It was about violations. Marcus returned before they left. His tone was professional but firm. Preliminary findings indicate improper winter waste displacement by Sterling Pines. HOA, multiple code concerns. This will escalate to formal review. I nodded once. And the wall? I asked. Celia answered. It's on your property. Constructed from material illegally placed there first. You're within your rights. That sentence traveled faster than the trucks. By evening, the HOA message board exploded. Emergency threads, deleted comments, reposts with softer language. The word investigation appeared for the first time. So did liability. Karen didn't post. The next day, contractors vanished. Plow schedules were suspended. A single notice went up at the subdivision entrance, printed hastily and taped crooked. Winter operations temporarily paused pending municipal review. Paused. The wall still stood. But now it wasn't the only thing applying pressure. Sterling Pines had tried to bury a problem quietly. Instead, they'd frozen it into place long enough for the city to see it clearly. Control rarely disappears all at once. It slips quietly, piece by piece. By the third day after the city inspection, Sterling Pines felt different. Not louder, tenser. Conversations stopped when certain people walked by. Doors closed a little faster. Cars idled longer in driveways before pulling out, like drivers were bracing themselves. The HOA tried to regain footing with an emergency meeting. No decorations. No refreshments. Just rows of folding chairs and a printed sign taped to the clubhouse door. Residents only. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. What I did have was a steady stream of updates from neighbors who finally felt safe. Talking, screenshots, audio clips, half-whispered summaries sent in short bursts. Karen opened with confidence. She always did. She framed the city visit as routine, seasonal, overblown. She used phrases like unprecedented weather and misinterpretation of responsibility. But then the questions started. Why were disposal sites never listed in the annual plan? Why did contractors cross a marked boundary multiple times? Why was the retention basin empty while private land absorbed the overflow? Karen deflected. Blamed vendors. Claimed verbal approvals. Promised clarification later. Later never came. One resident asked for contracts. Another asked for emails. A third wanted to know why no one outside the board had been told about the dumping arrangement. Silence stretched. That was the moment control cracked. A board member spoke up. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a simple sentence. I never voted on that. Another followed. Neither did I. The room shifted. Karen's authority, once assumed, now required proof. And proof was something she suddenly didn't have. By the time the meeting ended, no votes were taken. No resolutions passed. Just a notice posted online an hour later. Winter operations suspended. Independent review underway. Independent. That word mattered. The next morning, a black SUV sat outside the clubhouse for nearly an hour. No logo, no markings. When it left, 2 board members didn't follow. They stayed behind, shoulders hunched, talking in low voices. That afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. "This is Angela Brine," a woman said crisply. "I represent the Sterling Pines HOA." Not Karen. The HOA. She spoke carefully. Acknowledged the municipal inquiry. Requested a confidential discussion. Used words like de-escalation and mutual resolution. I declined. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just clearly. Everything relevant is already with the city. She paused, recalibrating. Understood. That evening, the HOA website updated again. Karen's name was still listed as president, but the footer changed. Interim Governance Committee formed. Interim meant temporary. Temporary meant unstable. The wall hadn't moved an inch. The snow still glinted in the sun, layered and compacted. flags snapping gently in the cold breeze. The vote didn't come with shouting, it came with silence. By the time Sterling Pines reconvened, for what would become its final emergency meeting of the winter, the outcome was already leaning in one direction. People knew it. They felt it. Authority doesn't vanish overnight, but once doubt sets in, it spreads faster than snowmelt in March. The clubhouse was overflowing. Residents stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces tight. Phones stayed out this time, no longer hidden. Transparency had become a demand, not a suggestion. Karen opened the meeting late. She spoke longer than usual. Words carefully chosen, voice strained by effort. She referenced decades of service, volunteer hours, past successes. She framed the winter as an anomaly, the investigation as a misunderstanding. She asked for patience, but patience had run out. A board member requested the floor. Then another. One by one they spoke, not with anger but with distance. Questions about authorization, about documentation, about why decisions that carried legal consequences were made without recorded votes. Karen answered some, dodged others. When a resident asked whether she had personally approved off-site dumping without written clearance, the room went still. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. That pause did the damage. The interim committee chair stood and read a single motion. Temporary suspension of presidential authority pending completion of the municipal review. Transfer of operational control to an interim board. No theatrics. No insults. Just process. The vote was called. Hands rose, slow at first, then steadily. The count was decisive. Karen sat frozen, red blazer suddenly too bright under the lights. For the first time since this began, no one looked to her for direction. Conversations shifted around her, past her, beyond her. Control had slipped and it wasn't coming back. Outside, winter sun reflected off the distant wall, visible even from the clubhouse windows. A reminder, not of defiance but of consequence. That night, the HOA website updated again. President suspended pending review. No explanation, no spin. By morning, contractors were officially terminated. New notices appeared outlining immediate compliance with city protocols. Residents began forwarding the updates beyond the gates, to neighborhood groups, to city forums, to anyone who would listen. The story no longer belonged to Sterling Pines alone. It belonged to the record. I watched none of it in person. I didn't need to. The change was audible even from my porch. Fewer engines, fewer voices raised in frustration. No more plows idling near my boundary. The pressure was off, not because I had yielded, but because the system that tried to lean on me had finally buckled under its own weight. The wall still stood unchanged, but now it wasn't blocking an exit. It was marking the moment authority collapsed, not with force but with proof. It came slowly, in narrow streams of meltwater carving lines through the frozen ground, in patches of green pushing stubbornly, through soil that had been abused, but not defeated. The wall shrank day by day, not by force, not by machinery, but by time doing what it always does, undoing what never should have existed in the first place. The city's final report arrived on a Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no phone call, just an envelope stamped official, thick with findings that could no longer be ignored. Sterling Pines was cited for improper winter waste displacement, failure to file compliant disposal plans, repeated trespass onto adjacent private land, and environmental negligence. Mandatory reforms were ordered. Annual audits required. Contractor oversight tightened. Boundaries formally surveyed and recorded at HOA expense. It was over. Not because someone surrendered, but because the truth had finished its work. Across the road, things changed quickly once accountability became unavoidable. Trucks came and went under strict supervision. New signage appeared near the entrance outlining revised winter protocols. Residents read them carefully now. Everyone did. People slowed as they passed my driveway, not out of fear but recognition. A few nodded. Some waved. One afternoon, a woman I'd never spoken to left a small envelope at the edge of my fence. Inside was a handwritten note. No excuses. Just an apology, quiet, human. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The shed took longer. I rebuilt it deliberately, piece by piece. Deeper footings. Stronger trusses. A roof pitched to shed weight instead of collecting it. Every board measured twice. Every bolt seated with intention. It stood better than before because this time it wasn't built under assumption. It was built with clarity. The wall finished melting by mid-April. No one touched it. No one celebrated its disappearance. It simply receded until all that remained was grass, flattened but alive, slowly standing back up. What lingered wasn't ice. It was memory. Sterling Pines held a board election that spring. New leadership. New language. Transparency replaced confidence. Policies replaced personalities. Karen's name faded from conversation. Not erased, just irrelevant. I didn't attend their meetings. I didn't join their committees. I remained exactly what I had always been. A neighbor. Not a member. Not an adversary. A boundary. Summer came easy after that. Evenings grew long. Windows stayed open. The sound of laughter drifted across the road. Not sharp. Not defensive, just ordinary. The way it should have been all along. I sat on the rebuilt shed's small porch one night, watching fireflies blink across the field where the wall had once stood. There was no triumph in it. Only quiet. The kind that comes when a line is finally seen, respected and left alone. Because the strongest boundaries aren't enforced with force. By the time summer settled in for good, the land had finished healing. The slope that once groaned under the weight of contaminated ice was green again, dotted with stubborn wildflowers that didn't ask permission to return. The soil, given room to breathe, reclaimed itself the same way it always does, quietly, relentlessly, without ceremony. So did I. The shed stood complete now, solid, squared, built not just to store tools, but to endure. When I opened its door each evening, the hinges didn't complain. The roof didn't sag. Everything held because everything had been designed with limits in mind. Across the road, Sterling Pines moved on. New faces on the board, new rules posted in plain language. Contractors rotated in and out under scrutiny instead of blind trust. Meetings ended on time. Minutes were published. Budgets shared. No one crossed the line anymore. Not once. People waved now. Sometimes they stopped to talk. About weather. About gardens. About nothing important at all. And that was the point. The tension that once crackled in the air had dissolved, replaced by the ordinary rhythm of neighbors who finally understood where they stood. I never joined the HOA. I never needed to. Respect doesn't require membership. It requires clarity. On quiet evenings, I sat on the shed's small porch, coffee cooling beside me, watching the sun stretch long shadows across the grass. Fireflies blinked where a frozen wall once towered. No marker remained. No scar demanded attention. The absence said enough. Winter would come again. It always does. Snow would fall. Plows would rumble. Decisions would be made under pressure, the way they always are. But now there was a memory in place, a shared understanding etched deeper than any fence or sign. They knew what happened the last time a boundary was treated like a suggestion. And I knew something too. That standing your ground doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like documentation, like patience, like letting people run headfirst into the consequences of their own choices while you keep your feet planted exactly where you belong. The cameras stayed mounted in the trees untouched, their batteries quietly draining with nothing left to record. I didn't remove them. I didn't need to. Their presence was enough. A reminder. Ownership isn't loud. It doesn't posture. It doesn't threaten. It simply holds. When the first cool breeze of early fall brushed through the pines, I closed the shed for the night and glanced, once more at the line where my land met theirs. Nothing marked it now but understanding. That was the real victory. Not the wall, not the fallout, but the fact that no one would ever test that line again, not because they feared me, but because they finally respected what happens when someone refuses to move. The land was quiet. The boundary was secure. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough.